The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of Hollow Creek's only hotel, leaving Nora Thornton clutching her single carpetbag as the dust settled around her weary form. April 1878 had brought an unseasonable chill to the Colorado Territory, and she pulled her threadbare shawl tighter as she surveyed the rugged frontier town that was meant to be her new beginning, not her final disappointment. "This is it, madam," the driver announced, barely glancing her way as he unloaded the mail sacks. Hollow Creek. Nora stepped down onto the muddy street, her boots sinking slightly into the spring muck. At 23, she had imagined this moment differently being greeted by the man whose letters had given her hope after losing her parents to influenza back in Boston. Elias Irving had written of his prosperous cattle ranch, his plans for the future, and his desire for a wife who could bring warmth to his lonely existence. After 6 months of correspondence, she had agreed to be that wife, yet here she stood, alone. "Excuse me," she asked the stagecoach driver who was preparing to depart. "Do you know where I might find the Irving Ranch?" The weather-beaten man scratched his beard thoughtfully. Irving, that'd be about 15 miles northwest of town, not an easy journey, especially for a lady traveling alone. "I'm expected," Nora replied, though doubt had already begun to creep into her heart. "Mr. Irving arranged for my arrival today," the driver shrugged. "No one's been asking after passengers. Perhaps he's running late." With that unhelpful observation, he climbed back onto his seat and snapped the reins, leaving Nora standing in the middle of the dusty thoroughfare. The town of Hollow Creek was smaller than she'd imagined, a single main street lined with wooden buildings in various states of construction or disrepair. A general store, a saloon, the small hotel, and what appeared to be a blacksmith shop formed the backbone of the settlement. People moved about with purpose, but none seemed to notice the young woman with chestnut hair and tired green eyes. Nora made her way to the hotel, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign. Inside, a stern-faced woman stood behind the counter, eyeing the newcomer with thinly veiled suspicion. "I need a room, please," Nora said, placing her carpetbag on the floor. "Just for tonight. I'm sure Mr. Irving will come for me by tomorrow." "Irving?" The woman's eyebrows rose. "Elias Irving." "Yes, do you know him?" The woman's expression shifted to something Nora couldn't quite read. "Everyone knows everyone around these parts. That'll be 50 cents for the night, meals extra." Nora counted out the coins carefully. Her funds were limited, planned for only the journey and perhaps a few necessities before beginning her new life as a rancher's wife. Every day spent waiting would deplete her meager savings. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Nora placed her bag on the bed and sat beside it, the weight of her situation settling over her. She had traveled over 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, and he hadn't even bothered to meet her stagecoach. After washing away the dust of travel, Nora ventured downstairs to the small dining room. A few men sat at tables, their conversations dying briefly as she entered before resuming in hushed tones. She took a table near the window, ordering a simple meal of stew and bread. "You're new," observed a friendly voice. Nora looked up to see a woman perhaps 10 years her senior with kind eyes and practical clothing. "I'm Margaret Wilson, the doctor's wife." "Nora Thornton," she replied, grateful for the friendly face. "I've come to marry Elias Irving." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "Elias, I wasn't aware he was expecting a bride. He sent for me. We've been corresponding since last autumn." "I see." Margaret glanced toward the bar where her husband was conversing with another man. "Well, Elias is. He keeps to himself mostly. Comes to town for supplies about once a month." "When was he last here?" Nora asked, trying to keep the worry from her voice. "About 2 weeks ago, I believe." Margaret studied Nora's face. "He didn't mention anything about a bride coming." The food arrived, and Nora found her appetite diminished. Had Elias forgotten her, or worse, had he changed his mind and not bothered to inform her? "If you need anything while you're waiting, please let me know," Margaret offered, standing to leave. "We're just down the street, the house with the blue door." Nora spent a restless night in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the occasional shouts from the saloon and the distant howl of coyotes. By morning, her resolve had hardened. If Elias Irving wouldn't come for her, she would find her way to him. At the general store, the proprietor provided directions to the Irving ranch, though he seemed skeptical of her plan to make the journey alone. "It's rough country, miss," he warned, selling her provisions for the trip. "And Irving's place is isolated even by our standards." "I've come too far to turn back now," Nora insisted, purchasing a small map of the area. Finding transportation proved more difficult. The livery stable owner refused to rent a horse to a woman traveling alone into the wilderness, and no one was heading in that direction who could offer her a ride. 3 days passed with Nora trapped in Hollow Creek, her funds dwindling and her spirits sinking. Each morning, she would wake with hope that perhaps today Elias would appear. Each evening, she would watch the sun set behind the distant mountains, marking another day of abandonment. On the 4th morning, she was having breakfast when the hotel owner approached her table. "Your room will be needed tonight," the woman stated flatly. "The monthly stage brings salesmen through and they've booked ahead." Nora felt her face flush. "I understand. Perhaps you have another room." "All booked." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Look, Miss Thornton, whatever arrangement you thought you had with Elias Irving, it seems clear he's not honoring it. Perhaps you should consider taking the next stage back east." The suggestion stung like a physical blow. Return east with nothing but failure and humiliation. Her parents' home had been sold to pay their debts, her few friends had bid her farewell with both envy and concern, and the little money she had left would barely get her halfway back to Boston. "I can't go back," Nora said quietly. "There's nothing for me there." Later that morning, as Nora sat on the hotel's small porch contemplating her limited options, she noticed a tall figure leading a horse down the main street. The man moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to the saddle, his broad shoulders and lean frame suggesting strength, earned through hard work rather than leisure. When he turned toward the general store, she caught a glimpse of his face weathered by sun and wind, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a short beard. What caught her attention most, however, was how he stopped abruptly upon noticing her, his expression shifting from casual observation to intense focus. He tied his horse to the hitching post and approached the hotel, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "Miss Thornton?" he asked, his voice deeper than she had expected. "Nora Thornton," she stood, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Yes, my name is Ethan Isaacs," he said, holding his hat in hands that showed the calluses of ranch work. "I worked for Elias Irving." Nora's heart stuttered. "Worked past tense." Ethan's blue eyes conveyed sympathy before his words did. "Yes, madam, there's been some trouble at the Irving ranch. That's why I'm here to find you. Mr. Irving sent you to fetch me." Hope flickered briefly. "Not exactly." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "May I sit? This isn't a simple story." They sat on the porch chairs, Nora's hands clasped tightly in her lap as Ethan explained the situation. Elias Irving had fallen on hard times. Cattle rustlers had stolen half his herd last autumn, and winter had been harsh on what remained. He'd borrowed heavily, and when he couldn't repay, his creditors had taken action. "He left 3 weeks ago," Ethan concluded, "sold what was left of the herd and rode out in the night. The banks claimed the ranch. And his letters to me, his promise of marriage," Nora felt numb. "I found your last letter in the ranch house when I was collecting my things. That's how I knew you were coming." Ethan looked genuinely apologetic. "I don't think he ever intended to follow through, Miss Thornton, not after things went south for him." The realization crashed over her like icy water. She'd been abandoned before she'd even arrived, left to fend for herself in a strange territory with dwindling resources and no prospects. "I see," she managed, blinking back tears of anger and disappointment. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Isaacs. What will you do now?" he asked gently. Nora laughed bitterly. "I haven't the faintest idea. I have no home to return to and barely enough money for another week's lodging, which I no longer have anyway." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful as he studied her face. I have a proposition, Miss Thornton, not a proper one like you were expecting, but maybe a solution for both of us. I'm listening, she said cautiously. I've purchased a small property about 20 miles from here. It's nothing fancy, a cabin, a barn, some decent grazing land, but I've been saving for years to have a place of my own. His words came faster now, as if he needed to get them out before losing his nerve. The problem is, there's a clause in the sale. The previous owner, old man Fredericks, was concerned about land speculators. He insisted the buyer must establish a proper homestead within 6 months, a family home, not just a bachelor's camp. Nora began to understand where this was heading. And how long do you have left? Just under 2 months. Ethan met her gaze directly. I need a wife, at least on paper, to secure my claim. You need somewhere to go. You're proposing a marriage of convenience, Nora clarified, her mind racing. Yes, madam, we'd be partners, not. Well, not what you were expecting with Irving. You'd have your own room, of course. I'd provide for you, and you'd help with the homestead. After a year, when the land is legally mine, if you wanted to move on, I'd give you enough money to go wherever you please. It was madness. Marrying a complete stranger for a business arrangement. And yet, what choice did she have? Why would you do this for me? You don't know me. Ethan's expression softened. My mother was left in a similar situation once. No one helped her. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. I'll be at the church tomorrow at noon if you decide to accept. If not, I understand completely. With that, he descended the steps, untied his horse, and rode away, leaving Nora with an impossible decision. That night, sleeping in Margaret Wilson's spare room after the kind woman had offered temporary lodging, Nora weighed her options. Return east in defeat, seek employment in Hollow Creek. Or marry Ethan Isaacs, a man she'd met only hours ago, in a businesslike arrangement that might offer her security but little else. By morning, practicality had won over romance. She had come west to be a rancher's wife, to build a life on the frontier. The man might be different, and the circumstances far from what she'd imagined, but the essence of her plan remained viable. At precisely noon, Nora stood in Hollow Creek's small white church, wearing her best dress, a blue cotton that had seen better days but was still presentable. Margaret had lent her a lace collar that softened the severity of the outfit and had picked wildflowers for a small bouquet. When Ethan arrived, he was transformed from the dusty cowboy of yesterday. He'd shaved his beard to a neat mustache, his dark hair was combed, and he wore a clean black suit that fit him well enough to suggest it wasn't borrowed. The sight of him caused an unexpected flutter in Nora's chest. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by the Wilsons and the preacher's wife. Ethan's hand was steady as he slipped a simple gold band onto Nora's finger, a ring he explained had belonged to his grandmother. I promise to honor our agreement, he murmured as they signed the marriage certificate. You'll be safe with me. Their wedding night was spent traveling. Ethan had purchased a small wagon for their journey and loaded it with supplies for their new home. As darkness approached, he made camp with an efficiency that spoke of years spent under the open sky. You'll be comfortable in the wagon, he told her, laying out bedding. I'll sleep by the fire. Nora appreciated his respect for their arrangement, even as she found herself studying him in the firelight, noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled or how gently his rough hands moved when performing delicate tasks. The Isaacs homestead came into view late the next day, a sturdy log cabin nestled in a small valley, with mountains rising dramatically behind it and a creek running alongside. A barn stood nearby, and fenced pastures stretched into the distance. It's not much, Ethan said as he helped her down from the wagon, but the land is good. It's beautiful, Nora replied honestly, taking in the wildflowers dotting the meadow and the majestic pines surrounding the property. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid, with 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace and kitchen, and a smaller bedroom. Ethan immediately began bringing in their supplies. I'll sleep out here, he said, gesturing to the main room. The bedroom is yours. Over the next weeks, they fell into an easy routine. Ethan worked from dawn until dusk, tending to the small herd of cattle he'd acquired, mending fences and preparing fields for planting. Nora took charge of the cabin, cooking meals, establishing a vegetable garden, and slowly transforming the Spartan dwelling into something more homelike. They were cordial to each other, respectful, but maintained a careful distance physically and emotionally. Ethan never presumed upon their marriage vows, and Nora kept their conversations centered on the practical aspects of their partnership. Yet slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small observations. Nora noticed how Ethan would place wildflowers in a jar on the table without comment. Ethan found himself looking forward to the evenings when they would sit by the fire, Nora reading aloud from one of the few books they possessed, while he whittled or repaired tack. One evening in late May, a violent thunderstorm struck. Ethan returned from checking the livestock drenched and shivering. Without thinking, Nora took his hands in hers, rubbing warmth back into them. "You'll catch your death," she scolded gently, helping him remove his sodden coat. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Ethan stepped back first, mumbling thanks as he retreated to change his clothes. The next morning brought clear skies and awkward silences. Both were acutely aware that something had shifted in their carefully constructed arrangement. 3 days later, disaster struck. Ethan was working with a new horse, a spirited mare he'd traded for at a neighboring ranch. Something spooked the animal, perhaps a rattlesnake or a falling branch, and she reared violently, throwing Ethan and then trampling him in her panic. Nora heard his shout from where she was hanging laundry. She ran to the corral to find him unconscious, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead and his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Somehow, she managed to drag him to the cabin, tearing her skirt in the process and scraping her hands raw. She cleaned his wounds, set his arm as best she could using wooden splints and strips of cloth, and kept vigil through the night as fever set in. For 3 days, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness. Nora barely slept, applying cool compresses to his burning forehead and forcing spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. On the 3rd night, his fever broke. Nora had fallen asleep in the chair beside his makeshift bed near the fireplace, her hand still holding his. She woke to find him watching her, his blue eyes clear for the first time since the accident. "You're still here," he whispered hoarsely. "Where else would I be?" She replied, blinking away exhaustion, "Our agreement. It doesn't cover nursing a broken cowboy." His attempt at humor was undermined by the pain evident in his expression. "Nonsense. We're partners, remember?" Nora helped him sip some water. "Besides, who would tend the cattle if you died?" "I barely know one end from the other." His laugh turned into a groan as it jostled his injured ribs. "Nora Thornton Isaacs," he said when the pain subsided, "you are a remarkable woman." It was the first time he'd used her married name, and the sound of it stirred something deep within her. Ethan's recovery was slow but steady. Unable to perform his usual tasks, he found himself confined to the cabin, observing as Nora shouldered the burden of their homestead. She learned to milk the cow, feed the livestock, and even mend fences under his instruction, returning each evening exhausted but determined. As they spent more time together in the close quarters of the cabin, the walls between them began to crumble. Ethan told her of his childhood in Missouri, of losing his parents to cholera, and being raised by a reluctant uncle who taught him ranching but little affection. Nora shared stories of Boston, of her parents' genteel poverty, and of the dreams that had driven her to answer Elias Irving's advertisement. "He wrote beautiful letters," she admitted one evening as she redressed Ethan's healing arm, "full of poetry and promises." "And you fell in love with his words," Ethan observed quietly. "I fell in love with the idea of belonging somewhere with someone." Nora secured the bandage, avoiding his eyes. "Foolish, I know, not foolish." Ethan's good hand caught hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Brave." June brought healing and changing feelings. Ethan regained his strength, gradually resuming his duties around the ranch, though Nora insisted on helping with many tasks she'd come to enjoy. They worked side by side in the garden, their hands occasionally brushing as they pulled weeds or harvested early vegetables. One evening, Returning from checking fence lines together, they paused at the crest of a hill overlooking their property. The setting sun bathed everything in golden light, the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn where a new calf had been born just days before. The garden rose straight and green with promise. "It's becoming a real home," Ethan said softly, his shoulder touching Nora's as they stood close. "Yes," she agreed, suddenly aware of how true that statement had become. This place, this life they were building, it felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since her parents died. Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious. "Nora, I need to tell you something," her heart stuttered. Was he about to remind her of their agreement, that this was temporary, a business arrangement? "I didn't just happen to find your letter at Irving's ranch," he confessed. "The truth is, I knew about you months ago. Elias would read your letters in the bunkhouse, boasting about the Boston girl he'd convinced to come west." Nora stiffened, humiliation washing over her. "He shared my private letters, not the contents, just the fact that you were coming." Ethan ran a hand through his hair nervously. "I knew from the beginning he wasn't serious about marrying you. He'd done it before, convinced women to travel west, then disappeared before they arrived. And you didn't warn me." Anger flared in her chest. "I didn't know how to reach you. I didn't know your full address in Boston." His eyes pleaded for understanding. "When I realized he'd left without a word to you, I rode to town every day for a week, hoping to be there when your stage arrived. But you weren't there when I arrived," Nora pointed out, confusion replacing anger. "No," Ethan looked away, shame evident in his posture. "I lost my nerve the first day, sat on my horse at the edge of town watching the stage arrive, saw you standing there looking so lost and yet so determined. I told myself it wasn't my problem. What changed your mind? I couldn't stop thinking about you. 3 days I spent arguing with myself, knowing you were waiting in town for a man who would never come." His voice dropped lower. "On the 4th day, I couldn't stay away any longer." Nora absorbed this revelation, her emotions in turmoil. "So your offer of marriage, was it just guilt?" "At first, maybe partly," Ethan admitted. "But Nora, I meant what I said about needing to secure the homestead claim. That was true. And now," she asked, hardly daring to breathe, "what is this arrangement to you now?" Ethan stepped closer, his hand rising to cup her cheek. "Now I can't imagine this place, my life, without you in it." The kiss that followed was gentle, questioning. When Nora responded, sliding her arms around his neck, Ethan deepened the kiss, pulling her against him as if he'd been waiting for this moment for months. Perhaps he had. Perhaps they both had. That night, Ethan didn't sleep in the main room. As husband and wife in truth as well as name, they discovered that the feelings that had been growing between them were stronger and deeper than either had dared acknowledge. Summer passed in a haze of hard work and newfound happiness. Their homestead flourished under their combined efforts, Ethan's knowledge of ranching and Nora's practical efficiency, forming a partnership that extended far beyond their initial agreement. In late August, Land Inspector Samuel Portman arrived to evaluate their claim. He spent a day examining the improvements they'd made to the property, noting the thriving garden, the well-maintained fences, the small but healthy herd, and most importantly, the obvious signs of a family homestead. "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Isaacs," he announced as he prepared to depart, "everything seems to be in order. The property is officially yours." After he left, Ethan turned to Nora with a solemn expression. "You remember our agreement," he said quietly. "Now that the land is secure, you're free to go if you wish. I'll honor my promise to provide you with funds for a new start." Nora considered him for a long moment. This honorable man who had ridden back for her when she'd been abandoned, who had offered her security when she had none, and who had gradually, irrevocably won her heart. "I believe," she said, taking his weathered hands in hers, "that I'm exactly where I belong." Ethan's smile could have outshone the sun. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle before setting her down and kissing her thoroughly. "You're worth the wait," he whispered against her lips. "Every day I hesitated, every moment I doubted you were worth it all." 1 year later, as autumn painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Nora stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching Ethan return from town with supplies. Their homestead had prospered beyond their expectations. The herd had grown, the harvest had been bountiful, and the cabin now boasted an additional room in anticipation of the child that would arrive with the spring thaw. As Ethan dismounted and gathered her in his arms, his hand instinctively moving to rest on her slightly rounded belly, Nora reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. The mail-order bride, forgotten by one man only to be claimed by another whose worth far exceeded anything she could have imagined in her lonely Boston existence. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Isaacs?" Ethan asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm thinking that sometimes the life you find is infinitely better than the one you were looking for," she replied, leaning into his embrace. The sun set behind their mountain, casting long shadows across the land they had claimed together, not just with legal documents and inspectors' approvals, but with sweat and tears, with shared dreams and promises kept, with a love that had begun as an arrangement of necessity and blossomed into something neither had dared hope for. In the gathering dusk, Ethan led his wife inside their home, closing the door on the wilderness beyond and sealing them in the warmth of a life they had built together, a life that had been worth every moment of waiting, every mile of journey, every doubt overcome. A life that was just beginning.